Thank you, Whitney and Debbie. April the 1st of 2001 is a day that I remember well. At that point in my life, I'd finished college and seminary. I knew that God had called me to preach and felt that He had called me to pastor. I just was waiting for God to open the door for me to be led to a place to serve. And so at that point, all I was doing was seizing every pulpit supply opportunity that I was afforded while I was working at the bank. Anyway, there was a church in Charlotte that had contacted me. They had an interim that was to begin like the following week, and they needed someone just to preach on this particular day, April the 1st of 2001. And so I obviously had nothing better to do and was grateful for any opportunity to preach. And so I said, yeah, I'll be glad to be there. And so I get there. I meet the folks that I need to meet beforehand, have some conversation with folks that are part of the church. They get me a wireless mic, and I sit on the front row waiting for the service to begin. And so 11 o'clock comes, choir comes in, and there was a lady who was serving as their interim minister of music at that point, and she kind of gives the nod for the sound person to start the track that they were going to sing with. So the choir was going to do this call to worship. And very quickly, I can tell that it's a tape that they're using. If you have children here today, you can explain to them exactly what that is. And so anyway, they press play on the tape, and immediately the director shakes her head, no, so it's not it. And so from the back, I can hear some fast forward, stop, rewind. So I'm hearing that go on. And finally, he presses play again. She shakes her head no and says, that's the wrong side. So then you hear the eject button, the tape get flipped over. There's some stop, start. Finally, from the back of the sanctuary where the sound booth was to the front, he hollers out, I'm sorry, you'll have to sing something out of the book today. I can't find it. So at that point, she just kind of turns around and skips the choir special and then begins congregational singing. At this point, I noticed something about her, and that is that she wore a charm bracelet that had not just a few charms. I think there were 19,000 on it. And she would direct with her arms, but it wasn't like a fluid motion like this. It was like the North Korean army or something. And so as she's doing this, it sounds like Santa Claus is about to land on the roof because of all the jingling that's going on from her wrist. The service continues, though, and it's time. They've taken up the offering. Somebody's going to sing special music, and there's this lady that is to sing. And so she's standing there, and it takes there's a long period of silence before the music begins. And finally the music begins, and as she begins to sing, I know that there's a problem. I'm on the front row, and I can hear her, but I can tell there's nothing coming through the speakers. And so again, the guy in the back presses stop on the music and hollers out from the back, you need to turn your mic on. Well, at this point, she starts messing with the mic, and it turns out the mic was actually on. He just had the mute button pressed in the back. And so somehow they were able to holler back and forth enough so that this could be taken care of. She sings, and finally it's time for me to preach. And kind of one of your goals in a worship service is to have kind of a crescendo effect so that hopefully by the time you step into the pulpit, you're starting with something. You're not at a deficit. I mean, the service is progressing. It's beginning to unfold, and you're not starting from ground zero. I'm feeling like I'm starting from ground zero, but things are going fine. And they're listening, they're engaged. But I can tell that because this church has stained glass windows, so there's some natural light that's coming in. It's 11 o'clock in the morning service, but I can tell that a storm has brewed, and it's beginning to get quite dark. In fact, the sanctuary, the difference in light is dramatic. And not only can you hear the rain beginning to come down like in a torrent, you can hear the wind blowing as if the church may get blown away. And so anyway, still people are with me. They're listening. I've got their eyes. I've got their attention. They're looking at me. That is, until such point that the back doors of the church blow open and about 10,000 leaves blow in. And this poor elderly man goes to the back, and it looked like a scene from The Wizard of Oz almost. And he is trying to get the door shut. And so in a split second, I go from having this, and this is all I see. How do you recover from that, honestly? In fact, I thought at this point, why don't I just say we're kind of through and just go home? But because it's like we went from bad and difficult, and things now have gotten even worse. All right, so we've been working our way in this series, looking at and examining the life of Noah, in a series that I've called Solitaire, standing with God while standing alone. And one of the things that we've noted repeatedly is a statement that you see in verse 1 of chapter 7 where it describes of Noah that he alone, and God saw he alone was righteous among those of his day. And so that's kind of bad, isn't it? I mean, if you're in Noah's shoes, you're not with the crowd, you're kind of out by yourself. There's not a lot of people like you. In fact, there's nobody else like you. That doesn't feel good. It feels isolating. And I wish I had some better news for you, but the reality is this. If and when you take your walk with the Lord seriously, the more that you do that, the more isolating it is going to be, because the less and less you are going with the crowd and you're headed in the opposite direction. I'm just going to tell you that can be and will be an experience that will prompt in you some feelings of loneliness. And I wish I had some better news for you, but the reality is this, and we're going to see this today in the life of Noah. It can go from difficult and get even worse. It can go from difficult while standing alone and get even more pronounced. But in what way? Look with me in your Bibles today to Genesis chapter 7. Genesis chapter 7. And we're going to start with verse 1, Genesis chapter 7. All right, then we're told, the Lord said to Noah, "Enter the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation." I mean, that particular verse serves as kind of the foundation for this series. You alone are righteous before me in this generation. You are to take with you 7 pairs, a male and its female, of all the clean animals, and 2 of the animals that are not clean, a male and its female, and 7 pairs, male and female, of the birds of the sky, in order to keep offspring alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will make it rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will wipe off the face of the earth. And Noah did everything that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came and water covered the earth. Noah, his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives entered the ark because of the flood waters. From the clean animals, unclean animals, birds, and every creature that crawls on the ground, 2 of each, male and female, came to Noah, entered the ark just as God had commanded him. 7 days later, the flood waters came on the earth. All right, so verse 1 sets the stage for us, that it's kind of isolating. It is isolating for Noah as a follower of God who takes this walk with the Lord seriously. He is viewed and seen by God alone in his generation as being somebody that is in connection with, following and taking God and his standards seriously. That became for Noah even more isolating. And for you, it can become more isolating, first of all, because of this. God may lead you to do uncommon things. God may lead you to do uncommon things. Let me set the stage for this thought. And I hope you've got your Bibles. If you don't, grab one in front of you. This is not hard to find. It's Genesis 1. If you have difficulty, please keep that a secret. Genesis 1, verse 6. That's very easy to find. It comes right after verse 5. Genesis 1, verse 6. God said, "Let there be," and keep in mind, this is creation unfolding. God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water from under the expanse from the water above the expanse. There is a picture that is being described here. And we're going to see it begin to unfold more in chapter 2. In fact, flip over one page to chapter 2. Verse 5. It's a repetition of the week of creation. No shrub of the field had yet grown on the land. No plant of the field had yet sprouted. For the Lord God had not made it rain on the land. There was no man to work the ground, but mist would come up from the earth and water all the ground. Then the Lord formed man out of the dust of the ground. So you're seeing more detail being described about the week of creation. Between these two passages, and we're not given a ton of detail. It's not completely spelled out for us exactly how this works. But based on what we're told, and sincerely this is what I believe to be the case, first of all, prior to the flood, I believe that things on the earth were very different than they are after the flood. I think that not only did the flood change things dramatically in terms of that which was living, but it changed the landscape of how even the earth itself operated. Prior to the flood, based on these descriptions that were given in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, it seems that you have people operating and land operating almost kind of like a terrarium. There's water above, because you see in chapter 1, it talks about separating water from water. Well, that's not just separating water from water in terms of making land, but water above and water below. That the expanse in between is called sky. So there's water below, there is water above. You say, well, I don't quite see it. Again, verse 6 of chapter 2, it says that mist would come up from the earth and water the ground. Why? Because God had not made it rain yet. It tells us that specifically. So rain is not falling. Rather, you have land, you have people, you have animals, you have plants. There's water below the earth. There's land. There's sky. But then it describes that above that there is water. It's almost, if you remember having a terrarium, instead of it being in a container of glass, that we were operating almost like in a container of water, that there is water below, there is water above. And so, the first time that you actually see the mention of rain is in Genesis 7. That's where we started. Look down to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, here's the operative phrase, all the sources of the vast watery depths burst open. The floodgates of the sky were open, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So at the time of the flood, all of the water above and below seems to spring forth. And at that point, then you have flooding. I say all of that as context, again, for the first point, which is this. God may lead you to do uncommon things. God may lead you to do uncommon things. Noah is told by God, I'm going to reformat the hard drive. I'm going to wipe everything clean. It's going to be a fresh start, and it's going to begin with you. There's going to be a flood, and God gave him the instructions about building the ark. It's very specific, detailed instructions about building the ark. How long, how high, how to seal it, where to seal it, all of these details. Descriptions of what animals and how many of each animal were to go on this. Noah is 500 years old when he first hears from God that this is the plan. He's 600 years old when the flood actually began. So there's 100 years that pass from the time that Noah hears that the flood is coming until it actually comes. Now, based on some details that we were given in chapters 5 and 6, you can reasonably deduce, we're not told exactly, but you can deduce somewhere between 55 and 75 years is how long it took Noah and his sons to build the ark. Think with me about this for a moment. Noah is out with his sons, and they are building this absolute monstrosity. Are they building it near the water? Almost certainly not. It doesn't need to be near the water. Why? Because the water is going to come to it, right? So also they're building this. And people have, we're not told this, but you've got to think, people start coming to Noah and to his sons and say, "Psst, what are you doing?" I'm building a boat. It's a pretty big boat, Noah. Why such a big boat? Well, got to get a lot of animals on it. Well, like how many? I mean, like, a dog, a cat, a goat, and a mule? Well, I mean, no, like some of everything. Multiple pairs of them. What? For what? Why are you doing all this? Well, God told me to do this. Well, why in the world would God have told you to do something as crazy as this? Well, because He's going to flood the earth. What do you mean He's going to flood the earth? Well, He said that it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. What do you mean it's going to rain? What's rain? What's where water comes from the sky? Noah, you okay? I said all of that about the lack of rain because sincerely, I do not believe prior to the flood that it rains. I believe that God nourishes the earth with water because we're operating kind of like in a water blanket almost. Water above, water below. There's mist that comes up from the ground. It doesn't have to rain. But then when the flood comes, things change. The environment in which we operate changes. And it changes, it's something that gets inaugurated with Noah, and that is, I believe, rain coming for the first time, but coming in devastating proportion. So bear in mind again this. Noah is out here with his sons doing this for 55 to 75 years. And how many times do you think people came along and said, "Noah, have you lost your ever-loving mind? I mean, look at the waste of all that wood. Why are you wasting all that pitch? That rain schmane. Have you lost are you crazy? No, I thought you were a little different, a little odd, a little peculiar." Maybe some of your grandparents used to say quar, right? Not choir, quar, kind of is a different word. Giving Noah the weird eye. What is the matter with you? And so he is isolated to begin with because he alone is living before God righteously in his day. Everybody else is doing their own thing without regard for what God desires, what He's pleased by, what He expects, what He's demanded. They don't care anything about any of that. They're effectively waving their fists at heaven, but Noah in his heart and in his life, he's trying to take all of this seriously, and that's kind of isolating. In fact, it's very isolating. Noah stands out before the Lord because of this. But to make matters worse, as if living for God itself was not difficult enough, not isolating enough, now God has led him to do something that is so bizarre. Build this massive boat, talking about a flood that nobody's ever experienced something like that. In fact, in all likelihood, they've never even seen it rain before. What a very isolating experience. When we moved to our current house, beside us there was a vacant lot, a 2-acre lot, and trees were being cleared. We knew that lot had been sold at some point, and a family was going to be building a house on it. We just had no idea what was going to be built on that lot. And so as the lot, and all these 2 acres, in fact, every tree, plant, shrub, everything gets cleared. I mean, that whole 2 acres is taken down to just bare dirt, and then they begin to build and build and build and build. Our neighbor's house is 7,800 square feet. The driveway going up to it, there's a wrought iron gate that sets up other wrought iron that goes all the way around the perimeter, marking the boundaries of this yard. Big white statue and a round turnaround entrance. There's a koi pond up front that's bigger than a garage, that's 4.5 feet deep below grade. Out behind it, there is this like pavilion, over 2,000 square feet under roof with an outdoor kitchen there. 7,800 square foot house. It is a whopper. Honest to goodness, it looks like Trump has moved in next door to us. Not only during construction, but since then, and we live on a cul-de-sac, there has been an increase in cars going by. And it's not because these cars are going to someone's house in particular. It's not because people are going to pay a visit. It's because people are coming by to see that house. But are they coming by to see that house because it looks like every other house in the neighborhood? It doesn't look like any other house in the neighborhood. It's the size of multiple houses in the neighborhood together. Now, there's nothing that looks like it. It is so unusual, and it so sticks out. In fact, if we need to describe to anybody in the neighborhood where we live, we say, oh, we live next door to the big house. And people know exactly what you're talking about. Why? Because it so stands out. It is so unusual. The more unusual, the more different a thing is, the more it stands out, doesn't it? The more unusual, the more uncommon something is, the more attention that it garners, positive or otherwise. I don't want to scare you. I don't want to depress you. I don't want to do anything other than just tell you this is plainly how it is. When you take God and your relationship with Him seriously, and when you take God's standards seriously, and I'm not suggesting that you and I or anybody are going to do this perfectly, but the more serious that you take this and the more you try to live according to this, you're going to be like fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer people in our age and in our culture and in our society. And the more that becomes true of you, the more it is that you're going to stand out and the more attention that's going to come to you, whether you view that as positive or otherwise. It's just how it is. Following God is by nature a kind of a lonely enterprise. But it can get, and generally often gets, even worse because this one that you're trying to follow often will lead you to do uncommon things. Think about what it's like, for example, to be a Christian single in this culture. Imagine it is that you meet someone and you begin to date. The relationship progresses and things get more serious, and then finally it is that you get engaged, you're pledged to be married, and your coworkers say, well, aren't you guys going to be living together? Well, no. Well, haven't you guys been living together? Well, no, we haven't been living together. In fact, like we haven't been sexually involved with each other. What? Well, who buys a car without, kicking the tires first, right? By the same token, why buy a cow when you can get the milk for free? Anyway, but they'll look at you, what is the matter with you? Because in our society and culture, it's almost now 7 out of 10 couples that wind up getting married have lived together before they get married. 7 out of 10. We're pushing that. So it's 70%, but it is more than that have been sexually involved before they get married. And so if you are saying, you know what, as a follower of Christ, as a Christian single, I know that God He's trying to keep something for me. He's trying to keep something reserved for marriage because marriage is His idea, it's His gift, and it's His gift to me. And so because of that, I'm saving myself and I am pledging my fidelity and operating with absence outside of marriage until that day. Is that isolating? You bet it is. Is it going to generate some ire and some strange looks and some questions? Absolutely. Because the more it is that you take this seriously, you will discover that God will lead you to do things that our culture and our society says those things are uncommon. In fact, they're more than uncommon. They would suggest that they're even weird. And as that happens, it's going to feel kind of isolating. It may feel at times even lonely, so just prepare yourself. But it's not only made to be more difficult because God may lead you to do uncommon things. It is that God may lead you to wait uncomfortable lengths. God may lead you to wait uncomfortable lengths of time. We're told in Genesis 5 that Noah is 500 years old when he first is told, as chapter 6 begins, about God's plan to wipe the earth clean. The flood doesn't come, and we're told specifically, verse 11 of chapter 7, in the 600th year of Noah's life. In fact, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, that's when the flood begins. So there's 100 years that pass between when Noah hears this is God's plan until it actually begins to unfold. Now, the ark wasn't constructed over that entire time. It took, again, we speculate somewhere between 55 and 75 years. But there is this massive delay from when God said something is going to happen until it actually happens. But this is what struck me. It's in chapter 7. And you say, well, he's waited 100 years. He's been working on this 55, 75 years. But look at the end of verse 9 of chapter 7. All right, so we've got these animals that have made their way on the ark. They came to Noah. They entered the ark just as God had commanded him. And then, verse 10, 7 days later, floodwaters came on the earth. This to me in some ways, and I don't know how many times I've read this before, but I was just struck by that. And in some ways it almost feels like adding insult to injury. And by that I mean this. Noah has been waiting 100 years since God said something was going to happen. And during this time, Noah has been out with his sons, and they have been building a boat of absolutely enormous proportions. I mean, nothing in its day, even remotely, had been built on this scale. Not simply boats, but probably any structure. And again, during that time, you've got to think, who knows how many times Noah has been asked by people, hey, what are you doing? Well, I'm building a boat. Why? Well, because there's going to be a flood. What are you talking about a flood? Well, it's going to rain. What do you mean it's going to rain? Noah, are you crazy? All right, so this has been going on for decades. And you've got to think that early on, Noah was asked a ton of questions. What are you doing? Right? Early on, he's asked a lot. But as the years pass, Noah becomes just the crazy guy with his kids over there building the ark, right? So after a while, he gets kind of dismissed as being the loony bird. People aren't thinking about it. This thing is being constructed for decades. I mean, it's a little bit at a time. A log here, a beam there. It's happening kind of slowly. And as it's happening, they have already kind of dismissed Noah and his sons. But finally, they start paying attention probably again as it nears completion. And once it nears completion, we're told that God caused these animals to come to Noah. You've got to think this is causing some attention. I mean, all these animals showing up, headed towards this boat. People are, what's going on? And Noah out there, all right, you here, you there. Oh, no, elephants, you crazy elephant, get over here. And so sorting them, getting them in the proper place. And then, once the boat's loaded, we're told God shuts the door. And what happens? Day 1, nothing. What happens day 2? Well, nothing. And keep in mind, you've got to think that people have been paying attention. They have noticed what's going on over in this area, and that crazy old Noah has gotten in this boat with a whole slew of animals. Day 2 comes, and nothing happens. Day 3 comes, and nothing happens. Maybe it is, and we're not told this, I'm just speculating here, perhaps people came and even yelled out. They're hollering, Noah, you crazy bird, you loon. In fact, you're in the boat with some loons. Actual loons. I mean, you idiot, what are you doing? We thought you had lost it before, but now we know you have lost it. You built this massive boat, not even in the water, not even near the water, of such enormous scale, and now you're in this crazy big boat with a zoo, with the door shut. It's not like you're selling tickets so we can come see them or anything. You're in a zoo. What is the matter with you? Day 3, nothing happens. Day 4, nothing happens. Day 5, nothing happens. Day 6, nothing happens. Don't you think that at some point Noah is beginning to think, even in a little way, I wonder if I have, pardon the phrase, missed the boat on this? I mean, is it possible I've gotten my wires crossed? I mean, he's already been sitting in the boat 6 days with all of these animals, and nothing has happened. You know, it's easy to see the 100 years that pass, or to think about the 55 to 75 years that pass as the ark is being constructed. But in my mind, as I read this, the most difficult span of waiting for Noah are these 7 days where he's sitting in the ark with all of these animals, and until the 7th day, nothing happens. But then, what happens? Well, because we're told in verse 5 that Noah did everything that the Lord had commanded him. Verse 10, 7 days later, the flood waters came on the earth. Verse 11, all the sources of the vast watery depths burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open, and for the next 40 days and nights, it was going to rain. Noah's experience was very isolating. It was very lonely just because he alone in his day was living for the Lord, but it was made to be even more complicating. It was exacerbated because God led him to do uncommon things, but then even to wait uncomfortable lengths of time. I wish I had better news for you, but I believe as God leads you and He leads me to do some things, sometimes it's going to be very clear, either because of what He said in His Word or because what He has communicated through us by virtue of the power of His Spirit, that there are some things that He is going to do, some things that He wants to be about, and we're just going to have to plain wait. And I'm not going to suggest that waiting is any easier for me than it is for you. And I certainly don't think it was easy for Noah. And I really think these last 7 days for him, as this passage unfolds, are particularly difficult. And during that time, there had to be some points along the way where even for just a split second, he was wondering, have I messed this up? Have I gotten my wires crossed? Am I really the crazy bird that all these people have suggested? But thankfully, this one who alone was living for God has listened to God and pays attention to what God has said and does everything that God has told him. And Noah alone and his family and the animals on the ark are those that are spared. I said that I remember at the outset of this message April the 1st of 2001 really well, because of how strange that day was. One of the reasons I remember that as well is this. After that service, I had people come up to me, and then they came up to others, and they said this: we need that search committee to talk to you, because if you can handle this, you can handle about anything. And that search committee talked to me, and for almost the next 10 years, I served as their pastor. You know, sometimes God will lead you to experience some uncommon things and to wait some uncomfortable lengths of time. But I'll tell you, and I say all that to say this, that puts you in a place where God can use you. God's not going to use the crowd, but He will use His followers, even when they are few and far between. Does He see you as one of those? Will you bow your heads with me? Even as we sit